So we've been going through the 10 words for a while now, and we've kind of gotten to the place where you could say that it's kind of the most common for people to know. Not murdering, not stealing, not committing adultery. It's one of the ones that typically go along with most cultures and how they view this kind of stuff, at least in the overall definition of them. And so that's basically the place where we are in this sermon series. And we've been seeing all along that in each and every one of these, there's more to it than just the normal words that we typically hear. There's a greater message that goes deeper with it than just exactly what it says. And all of it has to do with both the idea of how we love God and how we love one another. That all of these have some aspect to that within them. And so we've been looking at a lot of that. And today we've gotten to number 7, and we've entitled it, I Am the Standard of Marriage. And it goes along with, you shall not commit adultery. And again, we've heard this plenty of times before. Most people know this one, even if they don't know its exact location within the 10 Commandments. And obviously it'd be easy to just mention that and move on because we think it's so very simple. But yet, again, as we've seen with all of these, there's much more that's behind all of this. We can take those simple directions and we can understand those things, but if we really want to know what God's trying to communicate, we have to actually look deeper. We have to go beyond that. And ultimately, what I want to do today is answer the question of why we've entitled this. Why is God the standard of marriage, and what exactly does that mean, and why does it matter? Because God doesn't just give these things for the sake of giving them. There's real reasons behind them. But before we get into that, we have to understand that how they would have understood this commandment is ultimately, you shall not steal another man's wife, in reference to men, or for the women, you should not allow yourself to be stolen by another man. Both of these are the kind of ideas that they had behind it. It's not just the cheating that we see today, it was more specifically the fact that it was basically considered theft to commit adultery because the woman belonged to another man, is how they viewed it. And so this was the bigger problem that they have with it. And so it does in some ways differ from our view of it. That doesn't mean that what we think isn't important or doesn't even go to where this goes, but you can't just make the jump without understanding what they actually thought and why that mattered, and then bringing it within to our own culture. But as we go to answer this question of why is God the standard of marriage, we ultimately have to go back to the beginning, all the way back to Genesis. And it's kind of vague and not super obvious for why it starts here, but when you begin to look at it and dive deeper into it, there are certain things that come out that start to point you in the direction of what's actually happening. When the chapter 1 describes some stuff about creation, but then chapter 2 takes a different approach. It more has to do with the relationship between God and mankind and how all of that gets set up. And as within the story, we begin to see what God is actually doing. He creates Eden, the garden, and then he creates a man and puts him in it. He puts him as the one who has dominion over all of the creatures by having him name them, and then he creates a woman to help him out in this process of taking care of the land and all of that. And the more and more you get into it, it becomes it starts to become clear that God has done something, that God has created mankind for himself. He's created mankind as if they were his wife. That unlike many of the other gods in the ancient cultures who had other divine beings as their wife, God chose to create humanity to be that. But it's not individual humans, it's mankind as a whole. It's the unity of all of us together that really come under this. And so it's kind of a little different than we think, but it's the idea is that God wanted to dwell and be around mankind. This sermon really goes very closely with the very first one on having no other gods before him. They're very closely connected with what they are because, again, a marriage itself has to do with being around one another and being within each other's presence. And so what God does in the garden gives us an example of that. And then there's another place in the Old Testament in Exodus 19 and following. Austin's mentioned this before, but the 10 words themselves are a marriage proposal of God to the people. In chapter 19, he shows up to them on Mount Sinai in fire, and he even tells them to purify themselves before coming to the mountain. And then he goes in and lays out the covenant with them, and they enter into the covenant, and it basically is them entering into a marriage covenant with God. And that we can see playing out through the prophets and why they say some of the things that they do, because the very covenant they made with God can be viewed just as much as a marriage covenant. That because mankind as a whole broke that in chapter 3 of Genesis and went in their own direction, God ultimately goes and chooses a people, and so he chooses Israel to be his bride as a representative of the people. And well, as we know from the prophets, it doesn't end up going very well. Ezekiel 16 might actually be one of the most graphic descriptions of this, but there are some things in there where God basically retells the whole story of what happens. That he speaks of Israel basically just, in essence, being a nobody along the side of the road, that he comes along and he chooses to do something with them. He chooses to take them as being his wife. He chooses them because he wants to do something with them. He provides for them, gives them everything he needs, and is in essence the perfect husband to them, but yet they chose to go off chasing after all these other gods. They chose to reject what God had given them, and that's why, again, this description is of spiritual adultery that they were committing against God. And so they break this covenant that they had made with God in the sense of the marriage covenant, which is how Ezekiel portrays it. And so we see that once again, just like humanity broke it, so did the people of Israel themselves. That though God continues to be the perfect husband, providing for them, giving them everything they need, and loving them, people still choose to continue to go in the opposite direction. It's not until Jesus shows up and dies upon the cross and reveals the deepest kind of love that anyone can give to another that things seem to begin to change, that we get into the New Testament and the church becomes described as the bride of Christ. And in Ephesians 5, Paul gives possibly the best description of this when he says, "The men keep loving their women, just as the Anointed One also loved the church and gave himself over on behalf of her, in order that he might sanctify her, having cleansed by the washing of the water and word, in order that he might present the glorious called out assembly to himself, not having spot or wrinkle or any of the such things, but in order that she might be holy and without blemish. Thus the men also owe to love their women as their bodies. The one loving his woman loves himself. For no one ever hated his flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Anointed One also the called out assembly, because we are parts of his body. In exchange for this, a man will set aside father and mother and will be cemented to his woman, and the two will be into one flesh. This mystery is great, and I myself say this unto Christ and unto the called out assembly." Paul gets to this point here when he's describing these two, and he basically can't distinguish between the two aspects because they're so closely related, that God has so given himself to the church, to his people, that he can't distinguish that between how a relationship between a husband and a wife is supposed to look. And so, again, he's saying that he's speaking specifically about Christ and the church, but yet at the same time, it also applies to the marriage relationship. That just as God relates to his people is how a husband is supposed to relate to his wife. And so, again, we see that God gives us the example of what all of this is supposed to look like. This really helps us see why God can be considered the standard of marriage, is because he showed to humanity what that's actually supposed to look like by doing that to humanity. The other place in the New Testament that shows where the bride of Christ is mentioned is in the book of Revelation, chapter 21. And here, John is seeing a vision of the end of times where God has come back to his people. And at one point, one of the angels comes and tells him that he's going to go and show him the bride of the Lamb. And when he does that, ultimately, John sees a city coming down from heaven, the New Jerusalem. And basically, it's kind of weird the way that Revelation describes that imagery, but it's basically the same thing. And again, Paul himself uses building imagery to refer to the body of Christ just as much as the bride of Christ. And so it's still the same idea, is that he sees the bride, which is the church, the people of God who are going to live with him into eternity. That again, him being their God and their being his people carries the same idea of what it means to, again, the husband and wife coming together. That intimacy, that close connection, that continual being together is what is being displayed here. And so, again, John is seeing the bride of Christ in the sense of seeing the church. And then as we kind of finish looking this out, we're going to go back to the book of Hosea. Again, if you remember in that first sermon, I spoke about this, but I spoke about the earlier part of this, that God doesn't just leave it at the judgment and the problem that they have, but he still gives them hope in the end. He says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak to her heart. Then I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a door of hope, and she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. And it will be in that day, declares Yahweh, that you shall call me Ishi, and no longer call me Bali. So I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, so that they will be remembered by their names no more. And in that day I will cut a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will break the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and I will make them lie down in security. And I will betroth you to me forever. Indeed, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness and in compassion. And I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know Yahweh. And it will be in that day that I will answer, declares Yahweh. I will answer the heavens, and they will answer the earth, and the earth will answer the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and they will answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. And so here again we see God saying that though they are no longer his people, though they were no longer his wife because of the things that they had done, he is going to bring them. He's going to call them back to himself, bring them back to him, to the point where he marries them again, and to the point where they are his people, he is their God, that they are going to live continually in his presence. This is the promise that God gives to his people, the church in the New Testament. God is always giving this to humanity. He's calling all of us back to him. And again, it is this very thing that though we stray and go away from him, he's always calling us back to be with him. And that is the point of why he can truly be called the standard of marriage, that God has showed and proven himself to us over and over again. He's shown how everything that he has done has been for us, how much he has loved us, and ultimately, to bring it within our own context, how loyal he has constantly been to people who have been completely unloyal to him. And so that again, is how he becomes this standard of marriage, how he becomes the example for us to be able to see what not even just a marriage relationship looks like, but what relationships can look like in general. That it's not just within a marriage that loyalty and these other things need to be, but within our relationships themselves. If we truly are going to be considered the bride of Christ, we have to actually be unified within one another, or it's like a body that's not unified within itself, and that's not going to function very well. And so if we are going to see ourselves as the bride of Christ, we have to function as if we are actually worthy of him taking us to be his own. And so it's not just about marriage, it goes beyond that to how we relate with one another in general. But it also, again, gives us that example of what marriages can look like when loyalty actually exists within it, when people choose to love, even when, in essence, there shouldn't be a reason to love. And so this teaches us all of those things. We can learn from the word that he gives, do not commit adultery, so much more than just not doing that we can learn the idea of who God is and what relationships must truly look like when we begin to understand everything that the Bible says about this kind of stuff. And so, again, that's what I hope we can learn from this. We can learn the way that God relates to humanity and how we can relate to one another based upon that.